Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Magali. I'm pleased to lead this important section, namely conservation of artworks which depend on technology. The professor the media studies, Annet Dekker, at the University of Amsterdam, will present the paper how fecal digital preservation practices are failing sustainability efforts or a call for networks of care. Please, in the sequence, the curator Pieter Tjabbes will present the paper Platonic new techniques to restore the connected art. Finally, the artist Tamiko Thiel will present the paper 3 different works of art that are archived in 3 different collections. The collection machines CA2, AR, supercomputer, VR, beyond Manzanar, AR, unexpected ground. Please, Annet, it will be a pleasure to hear you.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and the other presentations as well. I'll share my screen and start up the presentation. There we go. There we go. I'm sorry about this very long title. I don't know what I was thinking when I made this up. But I think today's discussion will nicely follow from the discussion that was taking place last night, at least my last night. Because as mentioned in the Q&A by Oliver Grau yesterday, he mentioned if you update too much, you may lose some of your archive. And that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. So here you see some, well, quite badly sketches of workflows, in a way, of views, of preservation views, and particularly of emulation views, an emulation workflow, and a view path of what's going to happen, you know, when you start thinking about emulation. In 2010, Klaus Rechert and others wrote, emulators face the same problem as do every software package and general digital objects. In other words, I would say, emulators need to be adapted to the current hardware and operating system, just as much as the digital artworks. So there's a continuous growth in updating, you could say. This is also referred to as a nested emulation. If there's no possibility to port the emulator on the new host platform, the recently outdated host platform for which the emulator was created can then be emulated. So you get a box in a box in a box and a box, and it grows. So indeed, I mean, this recalls indeed the challenges of digital art that we've been facing for some time now. To just briefly summarize here, as the reading of all the code and software can be difficult, the economy of obsolete technology and the reliance on third, often commercial parties, makes it hard to access hardware and software over time. Similarly, perhaps one thing is available, yet its embedding in larger networks and webs of relations poses additional challenges. And with the consequence that maintenance of software and hardware can be very time-consuming and expensive. Digital art may be cheap to buy, it's another thing to keep it running. As well, with different people working on a project simultaneously and even over time, changes to the work will happen. Moreover, artworks can evolve into other versions, which makes it hard to define what an artwork is or consists of in a digital environment. And everything all the time needs to be checked if it's still working, be repaired, be maintained, updated, etc. So perhaps a word of warning in the sense that I'm particularly looking at those digital artworks that are networked, that are interactive in some sort of way. So in other words, what I think is particularly relevant of those types of artworks is that they're impermanent, they're variable, they're fragile. They're all the sort of defining conditions when you talk also about the digital preservation of these artworks. Nevertheless, though, I mean, many solutions have appeared in the last 2 decades to prolong this sort of functioning of digital art and also the digital tools, to keep entropy at bay. They are all digital, of course. So on the short term, most of the preservation efforts work actually quite well, despite some changes to the content, aesthetics, and information. Now, to come to terms to this kind of change, several discussions are organized around the acceptable amount of change. But something else happens which is less discussed. While the artworks need some sort of environment or adjustment to keep continuing, it's also the additional technical environment that needs to be updated. And that only goes so far. As a consequence, increasingly, as I mentioned, we see new tools and mechanisms popping up, which require also additional specialized knowledge and expertise. In short, this technical landscape is proliferating to a point where it's at times hard to know what is actually kept alive. Is it the artwork or the new layers around the artwork to keep the artwork functioning? In other words, we've entered an enduring technical rat race in which relatively small and often simple artworks can grow into large technical infrastructures and environments. All this becomes soon a dense forest of different hardware, software, and people. Now, this is unsustainable, I would say, on the level of the content. With every upgrade, migration, fertilization, or emulation, form and content may change. Moreover, the media environment in which these projects exist further changes their aesthetic functioning. It's also unsustainable on the type of the organizational structure. New knowledge and expertise are required to guide and solve the next technical challenge. And thirdly, on the environment. The enduring technical rat race is not sustainable in ecological sense, because these practices have high energetic costs, which results in a significant carbon footprint of digital art and heritage projects. So these challenges very much bring out the paradox, what I would say, of digital sustainability. On the one hand, there's the need to keep our digital heritage safe for future research, culture, memory, or evidence. On the other hand, there's the continuing need to update technical tools and methods, which poses an increasing burden on organizational infrastructures and methods, as well as on the ecological environment. Now, this ecological impact is not lost on most people, and there is a growing awareness in digital heritage organizations and museums. Looking at the literature about digital sustainability, the last years saw an impressive increase in how the sustainability challenge is tackled. For instance, by improving gallery spaces, minimizing waste, implementing energy managements, etc. At the same time, many organizations set their environmental goals by directing their attention to financial and staffing resources. While all these are very good efforts to reduce the ecological footprint, when considering sustainability as a problem of governance, just as much as a problem of technical and environmental constraints, can create space to move beyond the economic or quantifiable benchmarking of sustainability and address another potential area in which digital preservation can become more sustainable. So my current research starts by acknowledging this inherent contradiction, and in turn to think about a sustainable approach for the future of digital preservation that is both based on a deep understanding of the complex infrastructures in which these artworks prosper, and on the other hand, the integration of community networks and living memory and institutional practices. In such a scenario, collaborative networks form the basis for a more enduring infrastructure, and learning from methods of living memory can reduce the sole emphasis on technical development. And this echoes Kathleen Fitzpatrick when she said in 2011, a future preservation of digital objects may be less about new tools than new socially organized systems, systems that take advantage of the number of individuals and institutions facing the same challenges and seeking the same goals. So what does this mean? One of the conclusions that came out of my research in relation to the conservation of net art was that these artworks often are taken care of by different individuals, small organizations or groups of people with a similar aim, how to safeguard parts of the artwork. I've termed these initiatives networks of care. And from a pragmatic point of view, the characteristics of such a network are there is a transdisciplinary attitude, there is a combination of professionals and non-experts. It enables the creation and administration of a project that the transmission of information is held by a common mode of sharing. Everyone in the group has access to all the documents and archives. Ideally, this would be an open system or a dynamic set of tools that is used and cared for, where people can edit, add, manage information, but also track the changes that are made. Such a system can also be monitored by the network. An added bonus is then that if someone leaves, the project can continue because the content and information will always be accessible. It also allows people to take control of a shared project, thus obtaining meaning from their sort of investments. And again, this is something that was also iterated by Morgan Stricot last night in the discussion as well. So such a network should be dynamic so that individuals can easily move and projects can be merged or split into separate, smaller or specialized groups. So in that sense, there's also a forking possibility. Now, interestingly, this social aspect of such a network is recognized more broadly, as mentioned here by Pip Lorison and Vivian van Saas, part of the Tate network. It's not the problem of non-materiality that currently represents the greatest challenge for museums in collecting performance, but of maintaining, conceived of as a process of active engagement, the networks which support the work. Moreover, what I think is important to note is that the network should be seen as inherently part of the work, and it's not merely facilitating a work or preservation for that matter. Seeing the network as an actor rather than a tool or a method turns the questions of how individuals create networks to how networks can care. This notion of care is very present in conservation practice. Collection care is pretty much at the heart of conservation. Yet here I want to try to move beyond the caring for an object by following the notion of care as described by Anne-Marie Moll in her ethnography of healthcare, and by Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, who shows how care is always ambivalent. In this sense, care is not a matter of making well-argued individual choices, but it's something that grows out of collaborative and continuing attempts to attune knowledge. So to get a better understanding of the functioning of such a network, it's important to consider how it performs, how it changes, and how it can produce new forms of care. While it has the potential or may seem to disrupt the status quo, depending on your perspective, it's not merely about changing or choosing for one or the other. Rather, it's working towards a process of relation making, of supporting collective learning. This kind of network of care I saw actually reflected in several art projects, and I want to mention two of them. The first one is mouchette.org, quite an old website since 1996, but still continuing. And what I think is particularly interesting here, that Martine Nedam talks about characters and as containers that carry units of meaning. Now, an interesting part of the whole mouchette.org website is also the Mouchette network, where anyone can actually copy and edit parts of the site, but also start their own website, their own Mouchette in this case. But the network also functioned in another way, as was the case here when Mouchette was trying to make a game, and the game was translating between the different mouchettes that were actually taking place. And I'm very sorry, I'm not really explaining this work at all, but I hope you know the work or will be able to see it soon. Because there was this translation going on in a game that reflected on the original book and also film adaptation, the widow of the French director of the film actually came into contact with the game and was not really pleased at all, to say the least. So she sent this legal cease and desist letter to Mouchette and asked her to remove the game from the website. Martine had put out a call on that time at the time, saying like, well, I'm very sorry, but I have to take down a part of my website and the project of Mouchette. At that moment, immediately, several institutions, several organizations stood up and said, well, actually, we will host that part of your website on our website. So a network started to form itself around a specific part of this artwork. And it's still actually relevant today and working. Another example that I briefly wanted to share with you is by Igor Strohmeyer, an early net artist, already working since the mid-90s online. And he sort of created his own network of care, in a sense. This project is based on a project that he did a couple of years ago, where he started to delete all of his old artworks online. In an attempt basically to say like, okay, well, these works are not functioning anymore as they should, so I might as well delete them. Out of those deleted files, he's now forming a new network of caretakers. And he sent, in 2016, he sent 666 people an email asking them to take care of certain files. 2 years later, he sent another email to 333 people, asking them pretty much the same thing again and again last year in 2020. And as he mentions here in this lovely email, he will do this again in 2 years' time. What I think is particularly relevant in a way is how he describes his work in this way. He says it's a kind of a cycle, a durational, perhaps never-ending online performance with its natural rhythm, being constructed, deconstructed, then reconstructed anew, but this time differently. Who knows exactly what comes afterwards? But there is certainly no end to this cycle, because every trace, every move you make has its consequences. What I think the project shows is a new mode of active engagement and creative use. It demonstrates an engaged way of dealing with circulation and relations, in which the distributive effects are intentional, if not foreseeable what will happen in the end. Moreover, the repetition of the performative acts of sending and potentially receiving transform the singularity of an effect into a sustained engagement. The extended period of waiting for something to happen affirms the reality of the events that unfold, even if the outcome is open. It can disappoint, but it can also be the beauty of the work. The potentiality of the event, the suspense or suggestion of infinity, of inclusion into an adventure, which may reveal itself through engaging with it. Indeed, these images are hardly interesting by themselves, but together and as part of a larger whole, they are compelling because they maintain a suggestion of potentiality. There is no logic or predictability, nor is there a story other than the one I make of it right now for you in this presentation. And while the images remain autonomous, the sparse emails symbolize a promise, a proximity, which one day may be fulfilled. In effect, the project feeds a continuous desire that keeps returning with each engagement. Now, it could very well be argued, that this documentation or archival collection is a new artwork. And while this could be the case, what matters is that documentation becomes alive. Rather than static and immobile, documentation here mimics the characteristics of its initial artwork, being ambiguous, performative, processual, and networked. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annet. Thank you, Annet. It was a very interesting presentation. And now you start with Pieter. Please, Pieter.
Thank you, Annet. Thank you, Magali. Yes, I'm working as an organizer of exhibitions. So often we receive artworks that have a specific condition that present some problem during the exhibition because of mechanical problems, because of problems of programmation and other things. But specifically, today I would like to talk about Abraham Palachniki, a Brazilian artist, was born in 1928 and unfortunately last year passed away due to the COVID. He is one of the pioneers of kinetic art. especially in 1948 when he started to work with light and movement. We have been organizing, my company Art Unlimited has been organizing 7 exhibitions since 2013 till today. Actually, we have 1 exhibition on show now, a retrospective exhibition in Belo Horizonte, unfortunately closed for visitation right now. What we see in this image is cinecromático. It is open. Normally there's a fabric on top of it. But I wanted to show this because I'm going to talk about how the work functions and what problems this presents for us. This here is a, you see if it works, yes. It is a work in movement. It is made of motors, of lamps, light bulbs, incandescent light bulbs that slowly move around. And I will try to get it functioning. For some reason, the technology leaves me alone here. Something Annet and Tamiko to resolve. His work is done as a movement, as a poetic construction of a visual experience. And of course, if it doesn't function, it doesn't exist. And that is the main problem of his work. His works are functioning with electricity, with small motors, with incandescent light bulbs. So if one of the light bulbs burns, the work is incomplete. If one of the motors doesn't function, the work stops. When the work is not on, it is just a flat screen without anything. So the artwork doesn't exist. And this has been a recurrent problem. Most of these machines were done in the 1950s and early 60s. And the artist bought the incandescent light bulbs at this time and bought a lot of them. And then over the time, he has been constructing these machines using the stock he had, but he ran out of stock. And the cinechromatic works were sold to museums, were sold to collectors. And from that moment on, they were under the care of people that didn't know how it functioned, exactly how it had to be restored, because the artist didn't give any instructions. So here, sorry, I have to replace the screen to the other side. Here we have another work. It is an objeto cinético, a kinetic object. It functions, it is turning around. It is visible, here the structure is visible. It is like a constellation. It slowly moves and makes a little noise because it is all mechanical. It's made of very simple mechanical constructions, mechanisms that also need a lot of maintenance, not only during the exhibition, but also when they are at the collector's home or at the museums. What happened is, when we make these exhibitions, we ask for cinechromatics and for object cinéticos. And we discover that many of them are not working. The collector says, oh, I'm sorry, it didn't work. I don't know to whom to send it to repair it. In the past, we sent it to the artist. Often we sent it to the artist for him to repair. And his son also helped us a lot because he knows about how the work functions and so on. But still, it is a problem. His first cinechromatic device was in 1948 till 51. A very mechanical question. It was not. It didn't even have motors. It was moved by hand. The first one that was moving was in 1951 when he participated at the Biennale of São Paulo, and he made an enormous machine. And it attracted a lot of attention of the public and of the art critics. But since then, he made a lot of studies. So he was an engineer. He was basically he had a university training as an engineer, and then he became an artist. So he makes the machines thinking from an engineer point of view. Here you can see how he studies. He makes the constructions, the mechanisms, but all very handmade. There is no high techniques. This is the machine open, so you can see the several light bulbs, different colors, and the motors and mechanisms that make the thing turn around. And what you see underneath, here you can see the functioning of the inside. Lamps go on and off. These shapes turn around, so they give different shapes, different shadows. And this is the computer. This is the hard disk. And it's amazing because it functions. Each nail is connected to an electric wire. And on top of this goes this comb. And it circles around with a small motor, very slowly. Every time this touches one of the nails, one of the lights goes on. When it doesn't touch any nail, the light goes off. It's very simple, but it's very difficult to maintain because this wears when you use it. And so you have to revise it regularly. This is the study for the hard disk, how to make the lamps go in a certain sequence. The problem, the biggest problem is that light bulbs burn. And when this happened in the past, the collector just went to a shop and bought a new one, a new color lamp. But the colors were different. Over the years, the colors were not the same as the artist bought at the time. They were not anymore available. And also the artist painted some of the bulbs himself. He developed a technique of using a certain kind of paint that was not burned by the heat of the lamp. And so people tried to find lamps more or less in the same color. But with this, the character of the work, the visual aspect of the work changed. And then another problem occurred. When you use incandescent lamps, bulbs, they start burning with less intensity over the years. And they start to make different designs, different compositions. So how do we deal with that? The artist never thought about it. And he was a little bit the same. He said, okay, I'll give you some others, change. But they were not always the same as he had used in the past, because he also started buying lamps in shops when he was there. So nowadays we have several of these cinechromáticos that are not anymore the original works that the artist created. And I talked with him very often. I said, listen, Palaciniki, we have to do something because your work is being destroyed, because there are 2 museums that don't show your work anymore because it's burnt and they don't know how to repair it. But he was very reluctant in thinking about solutions. He just said, well, you know, you resolve, you find a solution, please. And we found a solution. Our illuminator, our specialist in illumination, he developed a new form of repairing these works. So what we do is we try to find out which are the original light bulbs that are inside and use these bulbs, open them with a special technique and put a LED light inside with the same intensity and the same color, light color, as the light bulbs, the incandescent light bulbs. And in this way, we restored several of these burned lamps with the original color. When I told the artist, he said, oh, fine, okay, yeah, do so. So this do so we took as a form of being authorized to do this with other works. It is not, so here there were, one of them was burned and was not anymore the original lamp. So I got some burned lamps from the artist with the original burned lamps, the original bulbs. So we could use the colors that he was using in the past to restore, because here there was a different color of green that one of the collectors had put. So the work now here is restored. The whole sequence is now visible. The problem is that we would like to do this with not only the works that we receive for an exhibition. Now, in the current exhibition, we have a very curious case because we found a cinechromatic from a private collector that had never been exposed before. And when we opened the work in the exhibition, we discovered that more than half of the bulbs, light bulbs, were changed for new ones, which means that it is a very brightly colored work, but I'd wonder if this was the intention of the artist. So what we are trying to do, and this is something we can discuss in this webinar, is what can we do? We are a private company that organizes exhibitions. We have found a solution to preserve certain works of artworks of an artist, but we would really love to extend this to the collections, the public collections. Unfortunately, he made approximately 33 of these artworks, this light artwork. And we know only half of them where they are, and 6 of them in Brazilian public collections. So from 2 collections, we had the authorization to restore these works. And we are trying to contact them now to show the results and to propose a program, not a commercial program, by the way. We don't want to get money from this. It's just, we want to keep this information available and restore these artworks and give all these artworks a kind of a manual together. So where we write down everything we know about these artworks and how they function and how we did the restoration, so that in the future people can study this and eventually have better ideas or better solutions. So and then the funny thing is, in one of these exhibitions we had an aparelho cinecromático, and from a private collector, someone I know very well, very befriended. And when the work was at the exhibition, we discovered that there were several lamps that hadn't been functioning for years. He was used to this work as it was. And slowly he was becoming used to other changes in the work. And then I phoned him. I said, listen, can I change the light bulbs that are burnt? He said, okay. And then I said, there are some light bulbs that are at the end of their lives. They're very, very, they're losing their brightness. What do you want us to do? I said, okay, change. Then after the exhibition, we brought the work back to his home and he put it to functioning. And he started yelling at me. I said, you've destroyed the artwork. I said, come on. You remember, you said, yes, but you destroyed it. Go back, make it function again, as it was. I said, but this was not the way as the artist delivered it in the 1950s or the 1960s. And then he said, well, let me think some days. And I thought, well, oh, there's coming a juridical claim. I will be broke because I destroyed $1 million artwork. What will I have to sell to pay all these debts? And then after a few days, he said, listen, I have been sitting in front of this work and I have had it on for hours and hours, and I'm getting used to it. Okay, so thank you very much, and we'll talk about it later.
Thank you, Pieter, the presentation. And now you have another interesting presentation. Tamiko Thiel, please.
Go. Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So thank you for inviting me. I love that story. I think it's what Pieter just said is really the conservationist nightmare, but it's exactly what you have to deal with. So I want to start out talking about a work of mine that might not seem to fit in because it's a supercomputer. It was the world's first commercial artificial intelligence supercomputer invented by Danny Hillis, who I got to meet when he and I were both graduate students, and I was in mechanical engineering as a product designer, and he was in the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab studying under Marvin Minsky. So after I graduated, actually, he sort of pounced on me and asked me to be the product designer for the computer he had been designing for his PhD thesis, because he had just started a startup company, this is 1983, to actually build the machine. And the big difference was, at that point in the early 80s, the supercomputers, even if they were called parallel supercomputers, had maybe 4, or maybe, I think the most was maybe 8 processors. And this one had more than 64,000, but very small 1-bit processors. And the reason why it could function was that it was all these processors were connected together in this 12-dimensional Boolean n-cube, of which more later. So the whole idea was that the supercomputers at the time were running up into a bottleneck. One processor was just not fast enough. And Danny said, well, you know, the human brain has 80 billion very simple processors. They're called neurons. So if we can try and build massively parallel machines, then maybe they can start thinking like intelligent beings. So he asked me to build this machine. The machine was the fastest supercomputer in the world in 1989. And then when the company went bankrupt in 1986, we went into the AI winter and everyone said it was a failure. So in 2015, when I found out that the Museum of Modern Art in New York was interested in acquiring one, I started doing a lot of back research, talking to Danny, and said, was it a dead end like everyone says on the internet? And he just laughed and said, you know, Sergey Brin is a co-founder of Google. He learned how to do parallel programming on the connection machine as an undergraduate. And in fact, the MapReduce algorithm, which was one of the major components of Google's success as a search engine, was based on Danny Hillis's whole programming paradigm for parallel processing. And then also in 2010, Google bought Danny's second company, MetaWeb, and his co-founder, John Giannandrea, went to become head of AI. So there's this direct line from thinking machines and the connection machine into Google, and you know how powerful Google is in the artificial intelligence realm. So first Moma said, well, it might have been a failure, but it was an interesting looking failure. And then I found this information. No, it wasn't a failure. It was actually the basis of the AI that we use today, now that we have machines that are powerful enough to do what we were trying to do back then. Then they said, well, yes, but is it important for design? also. And then I had my ace in the hole, my friend Joanna Hoffman, who was Steve Jobs' right hand, both on the very first Macintosh project, and then when Steve got thrown out of Apple and started the next company, she told me years and years later, he saw the connection machine, a photograph of the connection machine when it first came out in 1986, and said to Joanna, find me the designer of the connection machine. I want them to build my next computer. And unfortunately, I'd moved to Germany to become an art student. I had left MIT environment and the startup life, and she didn't have my contact information. So she said, I'm sorry, she's gone to Europe to become an art student. But, you know, when I was talking to Momo about this, I said, look at what he did then with the next cube. It's a perfect black square, a perfect black box. And look at his visual design sense before. The Macintosh was cute and cuddly and friendly maybe, but look at what he did from the next cube on. It was visually sublime. And then the curator Paola Antonelli talked with Joanna and confirmed that it was really the sort of the epiphany of seeing the connection machine that made Jobs realize that that these technical boxes could be something more sublime than just a very useful tool. So with that, I got it into the Museum of Modern Art. So to talk about the archiving of this machine, you know, back in 1991, the machine was replaced by its successor with a very different form. I wasn't involved in the design of that, and I realized that not only was the CM2 that I designed, CM1, CM2, going to sort of vanish from memory, but I also realized that no one realized what my part in the design was. I have this bad habit of always saying we, and part of it I found out is that if a you know, an adult man says we, then they figure, oh, he was in control. And if a 25-year-old woman says we, they figure, well, she was like writing down what everyone else was saying. So I wrote an article as I realized I was being erased from history. I wrote an article on the design of the connection machine, of the concepts that went into it. I got it published in design journals, and that was really the basis for my very personal desire to record my place in the development of this machine. That was the beginning of my effort to archive the design of the machine. So this is the drawing that I made when the Nobel physicist Richard Feynman was working with us during the summer for fun. He also used the connection machine to do his first simulations of the quantum computers that was also considered a nutty idea then, and you know, now is starting to become a reality. So he said, okay, we're going to use a 12-dimensional Boolean n cube to wire everything together. And of course, I was the one who had to actually wire it. I had to actually, you know, say, okay, this is how you're going to connect every single processor to another. So I couldn't just understand it theoretically like he did. I had to understand it physically. And this is the drawing I came up with after processing through a number of his explanations. And this is a 12-dimensional cube of cubes, and you see this repeating cube structure. And this is the machine as it finally looked. This is how the machine is exhibited in a computer museum. They just take the hardware and they put it, you know, somewhere on their floor, and they put a label on it. And so for the computer museums, and this is in several computer museums, then that was always enough, and that's only how it was exhibited. For the Museum of Modern Art, of course, they wanted to understand more about, you know, how did the design communicate to the people who saw it, to the people who used it. So for them, it was the article that I had written was really key, and part of what I described in that article is how Danny and I came up with this logo for the t-shirt that you see us wearing. This is Danny in the middle and I'm down here. We both have the same t-shirt on, and it shows that cube of cubes. But if you look closely, then inside of some of those boxes are sort of like pom-poms, and they're connected together with wiggly lines. So the cube of cubes is the hardware structure, the wiring, and the pom-poms are the software. And the software data structures could connect to each other independently of the actual wires. And this really was at a very early stage in the development of the physical machine, basically how we explained the concept of how the machine was built, how it was constructed, how it functioned to the outside world. And to make a very long story very short, you see that hardware structure of the cube of cubes in the black form of the machine, but it was also very important to me that the machine be able to show what it was thinking about. So what we ended up doing, you see on the left, one of the processor boards, those chips have 16 processors, and there's usually a status light next to it that says whether it's working, is it getting electricity. So we moved all those lights to the edge of the board, made the doors of the machine translucent. So when the machine was on and it was running, then of course you could program, of course, what the light said, and the legend is the very first thing that came up when they turned on the machine was, "I blink, therefore I am." It might be an apocryphal story, but basically my idea was that if you programmed it so every time you're using a processor chip, it's on, then you can actually see what the machine is thinking. And and one programmer actually said that's exactly how he used it, and he could just run his program, and if all the lights were only on a small part, then he said, "Oh no, I've programmed it incorrectly. I have to go back and make sure that as many lights as possible are running simultaneously." So luckily, of course, for MoMA, this was very important to convey, because this is how the machine communicated its own structure to anyone who looked at it. And this is, let's see if I can get this to run. Back in the 80s, there were very few video cameras around. You know, they were expensive, and you didn't always just have them in your back pocket. This is about the only video that shows the lights. And the interesting thing is, I used this video, I gave it to the engineers who were making a simulation grid of LEDs, and said, this is the only video I have of the machine actually running. And the engineers who worked at Thinking Machines for longer than me said, you know, it's too fast. And then I finally realized what was going on. It was the connection machine was replaced by the CM5 machine, very different, with just a display of lights. It wasn't showing the lights from inside, and that ran really slowly. So people who had worked for many years with the company, much longer than I, had implanted in their brains the speed of the lights from this other machine that came afterwards. So I'm trying to get to the next one. Here we go. So there you have the question, okay, whose memory was right? What is the correct thing? You can always say, well, the lights are programmable. So, you know, it could be whatever you want. So there's not really one real way that the lights have to be blinking. But this is all, of course, as Pieter stressed, if you don't record this in some way, how are they going to know? So I'm very happy that I was still alive when MoMA took interest in the machine, and that I was able to at least convey my information on the machine. So the next piece I want to talk about is called Beyond Manzanar, and it was actually my first virtual reality artwork, and it was finished back in 2000. It was acquired 2 years later by the San Jose Museum of Art in Silicon Valley, and then shown from then on in a number of exhibits. So this shows the very first exhibit in the San Jose Museum. And you can see that the light is not so good. It's an open space. There was light coming in from a security light above the doorway. The projector was not very strong. There's this big crate here because we were running off of a desktop Windows 98 computer, and there was an amplifier powering the little speakers there. But you see the general configuration of this joystick that looks like it could have been made by hand in the Manzanar incarceration camp, and then the and you are steering your way through the virtual world with that joystick. So when we went to archive it, then the description of the space was important, but the space as it had been shown and the space how I would want to have it shown. And then with the hardware, I specified, okay, the PC, what we have right now is not really not adequate. So if we can migrate it to a more powerful PC, a more powerful projector, better speakers, better joystick hardware, that's fine. What has to stay the same is this handmade looking joystick box and tripod and the relationship of the user to the screen. And then the other problem was that that the videos that I could make at that time, just like this really lousy one you saw of the connection machine, were also not very good. So here's the actual pages from my installation description with the actual installation and the ideal installation, saying, you know, if you show it again, please try and meet my ideals and don't take the actual one as the way it has to be. Let's see if I can show you a bit of the video. You see how bad the quality of the video was. It was really fuzzy and foggy, and this was the best recording that I could make at the time. So I did a video walkthrough of that, and then augmented it with this description here where I say, okay, at this time in the video, what's happening is you've entered this scene, and in order to move to the next scene after that, you have to go to this door or that door. So along with the video, I have this very detailed explanation of what's happening. It turns out the structure is a simple loop, sort of like beads in a necklace. You always have to go from one bead to the next, one scene to the next, but you come back in the end to the beginning. And then lots of screenshots, because these show the quality of the image that people were seeing at the time. And if I had just left the video, then people would say, oh, well, it looked pretty lousy in those days. It doesn't have to look any better. Just really quickly, what the content of the piece was about was the one layer of the historic incarceration of Japanese Americans in incarceration camps during World War II, because the government said no person of Japanese ancestry, even down to 1/16 drop of Japanese blood, can ever be loyal to the US. And then a parallel layer from my co-artist Sarah Hushmand on how during the Iranian hostage crisis in 1978 to 80, there were similar threats to incarcerate Iranian Americans. So we have these parallel levels that we depict, for instance, with these archival newspaper articles that are floating in the air. And then also because the Japanese Americans really did build gardens in Manzanar as places of refuge, within the confinement of the ring of mountains surrounding the camp. You could think for just some minutes you were maybe in paradise, but if you move too much, then you would see the guard towers, you would see the fence, and you would fall back into prison. And that's exactly what happens here. Your own movement takes you into the garden, but then that your movement also makes the garden disappear. You fall back into the prison camps. There's photographs of immigrants trying to adapt, trying to assimilate, trying to be good Americans, and then of course images of the incarceration, where these people, 2/3 of whom were below the age of majority and were native-born American citizens, but were imprisoned during the course of the war. So when we talk about preserving this, it turns out that the platform that I used at that time is the virtual reality modeling language that came up in 1995 as one of the first platforms that allowed interactive 3D computer graphics, what we call virtual reality, to run on mere PCs instead of $100,000 workstations. Now, this is an open source standard, and you can see there on the left, that is the actual text that is defining how the roof is built, how the wall is built. I did not use a 3D modeling program. I literally typed everything into a text file and said, okay, this wall has this vertex and that vertex and this vertex and that vertex. So in some sense, you know, you've got the images, JPEGs and PNGs, you've got some sound files, and then the actual programs is the 3D is the 3D content. There are no models apart from this text file, and because it's an open source, anyone at any given time, if they understand how to build 3D rendering engines, can go back and use this open source standard and rewrite a browser that would run this code. So also, because I was showing Beyond Manzanar again and again over time, each time I would migrate it when the operating system changed. And the company that wrote the initial browser was co-founded by my husband. It went bankrupt in 2002, but a very good friend of ours had actually written the 3D browser, and he went to another company, and that company is still existing, and they migrated it to all the different operating systems. So I've migrated it many times over the course of the 20 years 21 years now that it's been alive. And, you know, otherwise the image and sound files were all completely normal. And then, you know, in 2017, I was showing the piece in an art fair in New York, and I took the time to upgrade a lot of the images to higher resolution versions. You know, the original code was 35 megabytes, including everything. Well, not including the browser, but the program itself and all of the assets. And then now it's a little bit larger, but basically that plus, you know, I went back to the San Jose Museum of Art when I knew that they were going to exhibit it in 2019 and said, I can give you, in addition to your original version of the code that runs on, you know, Windows 98 or XP, I can give you a version that looks better, runs better on a Windows 10. So if you just buy a $500 Windows laptop, then we can upgrade the piece and it almost looks cinematic. And on the basis of my old instructions of how it ideally should look, this is how it looked in 2019 and was just spectacular. It was really, really beautiful. So, so that was, you know, there'll be another problem if the Windows is no longer compatible, backwards compatible. If bit management goes out of business, that's another hurdle. But because they have the original version from 2000 and they have this version from 2017, then they have, you know, it's always easier to emulate a much older version because it had to be much simpler back then. So, you know, maybe they'll even, if they have to emulate it, maybe they'll start by emulating the original version because that'll be easier to do. I don't know, but they have the options, and you know, part of my maintenance is giving them as many packages as I can generate. So the archival project I'm working on now was that in 2018, I got a commission from Christiana Paul to create an augmented reality installation for the 6th floor terrace of the Whitney Museum. Now, she did this big show that took up the entire 6th floor called Programmed Rules, Codes, and Choreographies in Art. and asked me to create a new piece for that exhibit. Now, the big problem was that I had been using one platform called LAR, which came out of Amsterdam, for 8 years to do all my augmented reality. And just to make sure, I contacted the developer support at LAR and said, I've got this very high profile exhibit. It's going to run into 2019. Will there be any problems with the servers? And they came back and said, well, actually, we're turning off our servers at the end of the year. You should not use our platform, you should not use our app because we will not exist. And there I was going, there was no other app that I could use to make this piece at that point. It didn't have the right type of augmented reality. And then my husband, Peter, who you might remember, had co-founded the Black Sun Interactive. So he had been working with 3D interactive technology from the developer side. He said, I'll take a month off work and I'll see if I can write an app that will replace the entire functionality of the LAR app. If after a month I can't do it, we have to turn down the commission. But luckily he was able to do it. And we produced this piece that we call Unexpected Growth. We essentially put the Whitney underwater. So the whole background is blue. And then you've got this colorful, beautiful coral reef that is on the terrace. But if you look closely, you realize that it's made out of plastic garbage. And we had another aspect, which was server driven, was that we looked to see how many people are downloading the app on that day. And the more people who download it, the more the corals bleach. So if you come on a Friday or Saturday when they're showing the piece, then you might actually see almost white corals. So that's a server component, which of course, as you probably know, is a little bit more difficult to maintain, but it's really just a simple concept. It just has to say, okay, how many people have downloaded the app, and then send me a percentage to change the color. So that could be very easily duplicated, even if the current server we're running doesn't work. Here's how it was shown in the Whitney. When you come into the space, you see in front of you these two 13-inch iPads, and they're set up so that you see the corals against the backdrop of the Manhattan sky. So you can immediately pick them up there as the mother is showing it to her child who's too small to look directly in them. And there's also instructions how you can download it on your own smartphone, and says, please go out on the terrace and take a look at it. So let's see, I might just run a little bit of this. So here's how you would see it on the terrace in your own smartphone. You see how the background is green or blue. Well, it's kind of a turquoise background, and how they are animated. So of course we made video documentation to represent it, and the videos are good enough these days. So it gives a pretty accurate idea of what it looks like and the sort of animation it has. But beyond that, we're going to give them also the Unity projects that we use, for instance, to generate the corals using L systems. So you see on the left, here's the very simple model I made of a flip-flop, and then with the L system, which is essentially an algorithm for rules of growth that are used in a lot of plants and in corals. You see the coral structure, the quote-unquote coral structure that came out of it. So they'll have the whole Unity program that has the different L system programs in it. You can see at the bottom the axiom here. I'm not going to translate it for you, but it means take my flip-flop, transpose it one unit, rotate it, and then repeat it, et cetera, et cetera. So they'll have that. And then the other thing is that after the exhibit, Pieter took the Unexpected Growth app that he wrote and then turned it into a more general purpose app he calls ARPOIS, and made it open source. So that's what we use for all of our subsequent augmented reality pieces. And we're now working with a project in San Jose called Hidden Histories of San Jose, Japantown, and trying to build up a community of people that hopefully will also at some point include developers who will help Pieter then develop the platform further. But one component of it, we create in Unity, we create the models, and they are prefabs you see then maybe in this web interface here for ARPOIS. Here's where we say, okay, we want a bush made out of zori, out of flip-flops. But then here down below is the animation that says, okay, when it's created, it should rotate for a length of 10 seconds from 0 to 40 and back again around the y-axis. So basically, a lot of the ARPOIS backend, Porpoise backend that we use to position the piece and deal with basic properties like scale and any animations and any interactivity is also in these XML files, which is not only machine readable but human readable. So basically, the system itself forms part of the documentation and would be relatively easy to replicate, as we indeed made a replica of the original open source Porpoise front end for Layer and turned it into the Porpoise, not front end, back end, turned it into the Porpoise back end for ARPOIS. It is on GitHub, and at some point we realized that it had been added to the GitHub Arctic Code Vault, which is a 1,000-year hardened film stored in a decommissioned coal mine in Norway. So the ARPOIS is not only an open source, but it's also archived in what the software world hopes is a relatively long-lived facility. And that's where we are now. I'm still in the middle of the archival process, and it's taking a very long time. But part of that is because the Whitney is very, very detailed. They gave me an incredibly long file with a lot of questions, and then I have to like prep all of the, prep the code, prep the documentation, prep the Unity programs. So it's taking quite a long time, but that means that it will be pretty well documented also with my intent. They are asking, what should be preserved as it is, what could get better. And the other thing is that we have already migrated it last year from the original dedicated unexpected growth platform to the ARPOIS platform. So now we will not do more migrations on the unexpected growth platform. We will have just one single, the ARPOIS platform. And like I said, we are hoping to get a community that will get involved in helping us maintain it. So that took a little bit more time right now at the beginning, but moving forward, that should help us preserve it. Thanks for your patience. I hope that wasn't really too long.
Thank you, Tamiko. It was amazing works. Well, we had a large presentations with many issues related to the theme of this meeting. To start the discussion, I try to propose a general question and some specific questions for each. We have so many questions in the chat for all, and I hope you have time to answer every questions. Well, my general question is: documentation is the most powerful tools of the preservation of contemporary art. I think you can already say that there has been a great advance in terms of specialized bibliography on semantic issues, new methodologies, and tools for documentation. One question that is always controversial is the artist's intentions and their participation in the documentation or preservation process. What are the limits of artistic participation? How to deal with the changes in artistic intent over the years? How to negotiate the discrepancies between the artist's intention and the real possibilities or the owner interests. It's on I don't know.
I think in my presentation, I made it pretty clear that I try to be very involved in that, and maybe because really from the age essentially of 25, I realized I really wanted to preserve the connection machine. I started from a very young age, actually before I became a professional artist, to think about intent, because I realized with the connection machine that my intent in the design wasn't really understood by anyone except for me. So if I didn't write it down, if I didn't describe it, no one would know what that intent was, and that was really key for me. So so that gave me perhaps from the beginning, you know, the opposite of what Pieter is having to deal with with his artist, who says that's your problem, you know. It's a very personal thing.
Yes, would you like to, Pieter or Annet, talk about this? Pieter,
modern techniques. I'm learning. From my point of view as an exhibition maker, of course, the most important thing is that the thing works. And at the moment that the exhibition is on and the work stops functioning, you want to do anything to have it work again. On the other hand, the artist might interfere in a way that interferes with the original idea of the artwork. In the case of Palachniki, this could be a problem because his works are very handmade. They're very simple constructions, simple techniques, simple mechanics. If you start to do it better, because you can do it better, you can make it smoother and failure-proof, but that's not the idea. The idea was that it makes noise, that it's a little bit harsh to work. If you ask to the public, the youngers, especially if you talk about the cinechromatic works, the works that work with light and movement, if they see it, they think it's a computer, it's a screen. Therefore, in the exhibition, we show this open work because we want them to know this is mechanical. This is not a screen. This is not something you can make on your computer. And then they start to think, wow. They think it's a bit awkward because if you can do it on the computer, why do we do it this way? And that is the danger that people in the future might say, well, come on, what's the deal? It has to work. So let's make a good film of it and we put it on screen. Who will see the difference? I know the difference. So it's very difficult. And the artist would interfere because he would change the color, I think. And it is his full right to do so. But if the work is in a collection, especially when it's in a museum collection, which has the obligation to keep the work as it is for future generations, how do we deal with that? And the artist says, oh, come on, I'll change it. I'll do it for you. But then it becomes a new work. You told it yourself, and Tamiko, that you had your own work preserved at the museum, but you gave a new version next to it. I think that's very intelligent, but in the way, with some works like the works of Palachniki, that doesn't function.
Yeah, and that's really important to be clear about. And my experience with the San Jose Museum made me realize that the curator is very interested in, or often very interested in, how did this work function when it first came out? Because that is then a moment in time. And so, you know, I was not surprised at all when Christiana Paul at the Whitney said, no, we want to archive, you know, the original version. So I'm always assuming that you'll want to archive the original version to have that timestamp, and then you know, I'll make it clear what I really want to have stay and what I really want to have improved. And then, you know, especially once I die, it's entirely the opinion of the person putting on the exhibit. Do we show the best possible version right now, or do we show the original one? And I understand and accept both of those as being legitimate interests and interesting ways to look at media art.
Thank you, Tamiko.
There's some questions in the chat that sort
yes,
of
so many questions. Annet, would you like to talk something about this general question?
I'd be interested in hearing if Annet has also something to say about this question before we move on.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a very hard question in many ways, and I think in the end it's going to be different for every artist. Indeed, and we've got the extremes here in a way already. It's like the one says like, oh well, do whatever, I don't care, and the other says like, well, I actually do care, and I'm telling you how to do it. So it is, and that's one of the most difficult things in a way with art conservation. It's like a case-on-case basis. However, though, that's easy to be said right now, but what happens indeed in 50 years if some of these works are, you know, fragments, half repaired, half working, half functioning, and who's going to decide then what is going to be done? And I think that's when it becomes really interesting, rather than it being dangerous. I think that's where it becomes really crucial, particularly to indeed invest also in the documentation of the work, and not only in the intentions, but okay, what has been done with it? What are the users? What are the audiences doing with it? And how is it conceived within the context? Because I think the context of a work and when it appeared is crucial to understand it. I mean, what does it mean to have a light bulb in relation to an LCD or a LED light? It's a huge difference. And it's not only about the light, there's also something about the technical history there that is incredibly relevant, I think. Same with, yeah, Tamiko's beautiful example of the computer. You know, it's this huge, bulky box in a way. What does it say about that time? We can't imagine that being the case anymore right now if we talk about computers almost. So I think it's about also documenting and understanding what the context was at a certain moment, but then also how to translate that into a new context. So there you come into the intention of the work and the artist, and you try to find ways. It's like, well, how can I convey what was happening then into the moment right now? And I think, again, Tamiko's example of the VR installation is so interesting because the content is still relevant today. The means of accessing is still relevant today as well. So there is this beautiful interplay of technology and content that go together and that are constantly meaningful. I don't know if it will be in 50 years' time, but certainly for now, I can totally see how that was preserved in this way. But perhaps in 20 years or even, we will say like, oh, now we have to do this very differently.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
When we started talking before this webinar, we mentioned Nam June Paik. And Nam June Paik has a very specific problem. He uses old television sets. And many of them are made with techniques that are not being used anymore. So there are no substitutes. And I was just telling that at one of our exhibitions, we had a work of his with a very small black and white TV with a cathode screen, which is something you can't find anymore. And then it burned during the exhibition. And what do? We cannot replace it. So luckily enough, we found an old shop that was, the owner was collecting old TVs. And so we were able to replace the screen, but that is once in a lifetime. And in the future, that will not be any more possible. So we have to find solutions for these cases because they will happen every time again.
Yeah, I remember also when I was a curator at the Netherlands Media Art Institute that we wanted to show an internet-based artwork that was working on different search engines and chat rooms. And the work wasn't, it was just about a year old. And we had to slow down our internet connection because we just had this fiber optic now in Amsterdam installed, which was great for everyone, except for that artwork. Because people were trying to move around into the chat rooms. That was a sort of 3D visualization, and they just couldn't make it because it went too fast. So yeah, the thing is that things change more and more rapidly, and so solutions need to be found also from a very different perspective, I think.
The point about things getting faster, internet connections, but also processors getting faster is a big problem. So that there, I think, some sort of, for instance, video documentation is really useful to show what the interaction was like originally, and then you can start seeing, okay, because maybe you think, well, it was supposed to be like that. You were supposed to be able to, move around too fast and sort of get lost. But if you have the original video documentation, you see, no, this is an artifact of the fact that everything is running faster now. And that's something that the artist might not have thought about because it's often not clear what is limiting the speed. But for instance, the speed of walking around the space with the joystick is also changing. And I'm hoping that people will look at the videos and say, no, it was supposed to be slow.
Well, unfortunately, you don't have much time, so it's like you read to answer the question of the chat. Only 3 minutes for each. Or select the most interesting questions. Annet or Tamiko.
I mean, I'm really going through the whole list at the moment now on YouTube, and it's amazing. The level of questions is super high, and I'm really triggered by them as well. What I find sort of resonates in a sense is also, well, how can we indeed further think through the documentation? Just move away from the sort of staticness of the photograph, the video even. That becomes this object, and how can we, think through this idea of documentation more and to expand it more in the sense to show a future audience in a way as to what was really important in a work. And that's what I also meant indeed by saying, like, well, what to me is really important is that we come to terms to that things are changing and that we actually take advantage of that change. And that we transform that into also other ideas about an installation, perhaps in the sense of a form when the form was not really necessary, or something like that. So that it becomes more creative translation process in that sense as well. Because I think it's going to be inevitable that we need to let, we won't be able to save everything. There will be, of course, always certain pieces that will remain working and that people put a lot of effort in, luckily, but a lot of things won't. And so in order to have some sort of sense of what it was like, the documentation in all kinds of different ways and by all kinds of different peoples. And here I think the adagium of the more the better is certainly a case in point, that we need not just one museum documenting something, but we need a lot of documentation from all kinds of people.
Thank you, Annet. Pieter?
Yes, there are some questions that have more or less the same question. Is what do you think as a producer, as somebody who works also with art conservation when doing an exhibition, about being a co-author of artistic production? Because if we deal with the artworks and we restore them or we repair them, we are kind of being the co-author in this piece. And that is a bit true. You know, Annet said, yeah, listen, if you change a light bulb, which is an incandescent light, to LED light, it is not the same lamp anymore. That is true. But on the other hand, we were very careful as to measure exactly the color of the light, the intensity of the light of the functioning ones, and to come to the same result in terms of light. So the effect is really the same as the old light bulbs. In fact, the light is not anymore the same because we are using a different technological solution. So in this way, we were interfering. And luckily enough, we had the authorization of the artist because otherwise it would have been a much more difficult question to resolve. Because now we can say, together with the two sons of the artist, say, listen, this was as the artist authorized us to go on and to keep these machines functioning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pieter. Tamiko, please.
Yeah, I think I would address, there's a number of questions about storyboarding, or what sort of documentation. I think it would be very, very useful to do a video interview with the artist, because the conservationist is going to ask questions that the artist might not even think about, and the artist might also voice concerns that the conservationist wouldn't think about. So that sort of dialogue, much more so than filling out, some form, or, being told to write something down. Also because, of course, not all artists, I went out and wrote an academic paper. It was my first academic paper, and I don't like writing academic papers. And some people can't do it or won't do it. So, you need also, in the same way that, some people learn better when they hear something, some people better when they read something, some people better when they're shown something. In the same way, an artist will be able to talk more about their work in a different modality depending on what person they are. So definitely, what the other two have been saying, use all the modalities you have to try and get more information. And storyboarding is in the sense of me narrating the user experience, how what happens when you first come in the space, what are you supposed to be feeling, what can you explore, what directions can you go, I mean, the whole thing could be very, very long, and so it's what ends up getting put on paper is much shorter than the optimal, but maybe having a walkthrough with, for instance, a conservationist being recorded in video, so that it becomes a conversation and a back and forth with someone who knows the work too well because they created it, and someone who's looking from the outside and is curious to understand more about it. I think that would be extremely, extremely fruitful. And I actually haven't done that really with so much with any of the projects, but I'm going to suggest it to the Whitney.
Thank you, Tamiko. Well, unfortunately, you should close the section today, but the discussion continue. I think that. Well, I find it very difficult to summarize and conclude the section. I think that preservation of media arts allow us to really understand the idea of the complex and delicate system proposed by Deborah Hess, in which she highlights the law of interdependence of ecology, in which everything is connected connect and mix with everything. You are in it together. I think that's it. Thank you very much, the presentation, Annet.
And thank you very much, Annet, for talking about contextualization, because I think that's something that I hadn't sort of thought of in that way. And I think that's exactly right. I think you're dead on.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you have more one more thing to say, okay, Annet, Pieter, to close the section. You have 5 minutes.
I think it's very rewarding and very, I learned a lot, both from Tamiko and from Annet. I certainly will contact Annet because I think I need some guidance how to preserve the idea of the works of Palaciniki specifically, and the ways I can leave this for further generations in some way, somewhere, because here in Brazil we have a very fragile system if we talk about archives. And so this is something we can think about, and maybe there are many people in Brazil like Magali and others who are thinking about it, about conservation, but there is no central point where we can leave our experience, our thoughts, and I think that would be great. And maybe the File Festival has taken this initiative to talk about this for 3 days, and I think this is very rich, and they can also be very helpful in bringing me on the right track. Thank you.
I mean, I think, yeah, maybe Brazil doesn't have the sort of right infrastructure from how we view indeed the conservation of these artworks, but I think Brazil has something perhaps even more valuable in the long term, and that's living history. It's an oral cultures which are very strong, also really present in Brazil, and I think that's where we actually can learn a lot from. It's going back indeed, well, how do you indeed tell stories? And how do you preserve memory through indeed remembering?
Yeah, Indian tribes.
Yes.
Look here, the Indian art on my wall.
Exactly.
Indian tribes, they are purely oral.
Exactly.
Well, so we thank everyone for their participation, and remember that the videos will be available on the platform. So, and thank you very much for the host.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us to this wonderful discussion, and thank you, Annet and Pieter. I've learned so much from you just these couple of hours.